Segment 3, enhanced interrogation. Quoting from a White House press conference that took place in April. Question, Mr. President, do you believe that the previous administration, that is the administration of George W. Bush, sanctioned torture? President Obama, what I've said, and I will repeat, is that waterboarding violates our ideals and our values. I do believe that it is torture, close quote. Strictly as a legal matter, was President Obama correct that waterboarding is torture?
Well, I would say I think under the previous administration, it was the view of the government and the Justice Department that it was not. And that was a view, I think, consistently held.
You recognize the obvious problem for a layman.
Yes.
It's a horrible, gruesome procedure. How do you, as a legal matter, draw the lines, draw the distinctions between what is torture and therefore legally impermissible and what isn't?
It's hard for a lawyer or a layman. I mean, the problem is that Congress passed a law prohibiting torture, and all it did was say torture is the intentional infliction of severe physical pain or suffering. That was it. It didn't list anything about what qualified as torture and what was not torture. There are some people who think in the human rights community that keeping someone in solitary confinement is torture. There are some people who think that physical abuse is torture. Right? So the hard thing for a lawyer is to figure out, well, what's inside and what's outside the line. And I think reasonable people can have differences about it. And this is before you even get to the question of whether it's even a good idea.
Right.
It's a matter of policy, just whether it's legal. I think waterboarding is very close to the line, and I think the administration really struggled with the previous administration really struggled with the question.
What did you, as a lawyer, when you were attempting to decide that question, when you were deciding that question, we know that courts in Israel have grappled with these questions for several decades, right? What do you reach for? What do you read? What do you go to?
This is a good question. There's a problem because this statute had never been interpreted by the courts.
The statute dates from?
The early 90s.
All right.
The statute had never been interpreted by the courts. The Justice Department had not prosecuted anyone under it. So there was none of the books off the shelf where you could open up a case or a definition and say, oh, this is what Congress meant. And so we looked at everything. We looked at, as you said, the Israeli experience, the British experience, analogous cases in the United States, and made up a list of the different kinds of cases and what other countries or other contexts people had thought to be torture or not. And I think did our best under the circumstances. Remember, we're only 1 year into 9/11 when our intelligence agency scored the coup of capturing the number 3 person in Al-Qaeda. And everyone thought there were still follow-on attacks planned. I think if you talk to people who lived in New York City after 9/11, everyone would have thought there were going to be more attacks. So I think the pressure on the government was enormous to try to get as much actionable intelligence as possible to stop another 9/11 attack.
Okay, let me continue to quote from that press conference in April. Question, sir, did you read the documents recently referred to by former Vice President Cheney saying that the use of so-called enhanced interrogation techniques not only protected the nation but saved lives? President Obama, I have read the documents. That we got information from these individuals that were subjected to these techniques doesn't answer the core question, which is, could we have gotten the same information without resorting to these techniques? And it doesn't answer the broader question, are we safer as a consequence of having used these techniques? What do you think? Could we have gotten information short of the so-called enhanced interrogation techniques?
First of all, you have to rely on what the people who actually had the intelligence at the time knew, people like the CIA director, people like the president, the vice president, national security advisor. They all have said, I think in public, that this information was important and it did save lives and did stop attacks. I think it's...
Don't you at some level want to just say, President Obama, you are being silly. The security of the nation was directly at risk, and we had people in custody who knew things. If we could get the information, it could save lives. The notion that we have to work our way up some gradual scale and that some set of techniques, which we had already construed as legal, could only be used as a very just ridiculous. You're being silly. Don't you want to say that, John, or not?
I wouldn't say silly. I would say naive. I think it's naive to say, oh, well, maybe we could have gotten it some other way. I mean, you could always say that. You could say, well, if Lincoln had not right, gone after the South, maybe slavery would have ended on its own and the country would have reunified in 20 or 30 years. I mean, it's impossible to answer a counterfactual like that.
Right.
That's one thing. The second thing is we certainly haven't got a lot of intelligence from operatives who we arrested, brought back to the United States, and put on trial in our federal courts. I mean, you look at what happened to the people responsible for the first World Trade Center bombing. They're still, preaching hatred.
The so-called blind
Sheikh
right.
and his followers. You didn't get a lot of intelligence out of them. So I think if you try to do what I think this administration is moving towards, which is give people Miranda warnings, give them a lawyer, bring them back to the United States and put them in trial in New York City, you're not going to get any intelligence that's going to be of great value. In terms of an ongoing war, I don't think it's a bad idea to do all that stuff when the war is over. But when you're in the middle of a conflict, all that intelligence that you can get, anything that comes out in public is enormous value.
So, final question in this segment. Would it be all right with you if President Obama had said something like this? My position is no waterboarding, nothing that a layman would construe as torture, now that the threat no longer seems imminent. But as chief executive, I reserve the right to revisit the situation if the defense of this nation comes under direct threat once again. Would that comport with your notion that there's a certain flexibility here?
Yeah, I think that would actually be the more mature, sensible policy, would be to say we may do things differently than the last one, but that's because we think the threat is reduced. But if the threat grows again to the point where they can launch another direct attack on the United States, we need to have at least the option of doing these kinds of things again. And I think there are probably people in this administration who think that's what their position is.